Welcome and thank you for joining us for this webinar on ethical and regulatory considerations in xenotransplantation clinical trials, patient selection, equity and access, and waitlisting. This webinar is presented by the AST Psychosocial and Ethics Community of Practice. Before we begin the main presentation, we have a few housekeeping notes to help you engage with today's discussion. There is currently a viewership polling question displayed for the audience. Please take a moment to answer this question while we finish the remaining announcements. This webinar is being recorded and the archive will be available on the Psychosocial and Ethics COP Hub and on AST's YouTube channel. Please note that all your lines have been muted so that only the presenters can be heard for the archived recording. If you have a question for our panelists during the webinar, we encourage you to participate by using the Q&A section in the Zoom webinar panel to submit your questions for consideration. Questions submitted via the chat section may be missed during the presentation. If there are questions we do not have time for, we will either answer them individually offline or we will post the full question with the answer following the webinar. Finally, when you log off at the conclusion of today's webinar, you will see a link to the brief survey to complete. Please fill out this survey because it helps us keep our content current and engaging. I will now turn the session over to the chair of the Psychosocial and Ethics COP, Dr. Elisa Gordon, to begin our presentation.
Great, thank you so much. Hi, I'm Elisa Gordon. I wanted to thank you all so much for joining us today. We've got a fantastic lineup, and I wanted to acknowledge and give great thanks to Dr. Carrie Thiessen, who organized this session, and also thank the AST staff, Anne and Olivia. And I wanted to give you all a reminder that this is a public forum, which means that it is open to non-AST members as well as members of the media who may be joining us on this webinar. So with that, I will hand this off to Karen Maschke, who is our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Maschke. I'm a research scholar at the Hastings Center, which is a bioethics research institution in New York, about 70 miles north of New York City. And I do work on ethical, legal, and regulatory issues related to new biomedical technologies. We have 3 speakers today. I'm going to just give you a really quick introduction of each one, and then they will start their presentations for about 9 minutes each. Please put your questions in the chat, in the question and answer session, and I'll be moderating that and get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. So we'll have Dr. Andrew Adams, who will speak first. He's a transplant surgeon at the University of Minnesota and has conducted extensive research on xenotransplantation. The next speaker will be Dr. Henry Silverman. He is a physician and the chair of the ethics committee at the University of Maryland that approved the cardiac xenotransplantation research protocol that many of you probably know about. And he's written extensively on research ethics issues. And then we have Dr. Brendan Parent, who is a lawyer and a transplant ethicist at New York University. Dr. Parent has written extensively on transplantation and is currently researching the regulatory framework for xenotransplantation. So I will turn it over to everyone and get started.
Thanks, Karen. I think I'm up first. Appreciate the opportunity to start this dialogue. So my job was really just to review kind of where we are, both from the research standpoint and clinically, with regards to xenotransplantation, a few disclosures that I have. I think, focusing on kidney, but the same could be said for heart. There's an ever increasing, number of patients who suffer from end-stage organ disease. And it's just to show this not just in the US, but worldwide. That's put an ever increasing pressure on the, financial component of healthcare as well. And this isn't going anywhere anytime soon. If you look at the rising obesity epidemic, and also that we've become better at treating patients as they have end-stage renal disease on dialysis, they live longer. And so there are more and more patients who suffer from end-stage organ disease and would benefit from a transplant. We know from kidney transplant, heart transplant, liver transplant, these all are therapies, destination therapies for end-stage organ disease that provide better quality of life, better outcomes for these patients and lead to a longer lifespan afterwards. So our challenges in transplantation really are, we have too few organs for the number of people who might benefit from those. And once they get a transplant, they don't last long enough. So many patients in the end, when their transplant fails, need another second, sometimes third. This is particularly important in pediatric populations. And it's just illustrated here, the ever increasing number on the wait list. Some of that's been diminished with the recent opioid epidemic and increase in deceased donors, but even with that significant increase in deceased donors, that's really not made an impact, a meaningful impact anyway, on the number of patients who are waiting for a transplant. In fact, in the hour that we spend today in this webinar, another patient will die on the waiting list, and 6 or 7 more will be added to the wait list during that time. So when we think about solutions with regards to increasing the supply of donor organs or decreasing the demand, there are many avenues that are currently the focus of research, and a lot of effort has been placed toward that end, and progress has been made. But I think really one that's generated a lot of enthusiasm and excitement over the last few years is xenotransplantation. And it's not that the concept is new, it's been around for a number of years, but the changes in technology, the advances we've seen in basic and translational research really have set the stage to be able to ask the question, is it time to kind of move forward with clinical translation? So when we speak about xenotransplantation, we're talking about using another species' organs for transplant into humans in this case. We can think about in the past, in the beginnings of xenotransplantation, the concept was using evolutionarily close species such as primates, non-human primates. And that really bore out to have some serious ethical and infectious concerns, not to mention practical, and albeit lower on the totem pole of concerns, still immunologic. So these concordant xenografts, ones that are evolutionarily close and tend to be more immunologically readily accepted, although there are challenges there, were where we started. And that really is not an option anymore for a variety of reasons that we don't have time to get into today. And generally speaking, most people accept that genetically modified pigs will probably be the answer moving forward. This brings a whole host of other issues, but some of the same concerns we have with concordant xenografts exist with discordant xenografts, although the immunologic concerns were really primary and really were at the forefront of research as we kind of proceeded through that. This is just a few quotes from leaders in the field of transplantation, Nobel laureates, etc. Sir Peter Medawar saying that one day, if we try hard enough, xenotransplantation will be the answer, and maybe in 15 years. Of course, that wasn't correct. Sir Roy Kahn, a very famous liver transplant surgeon from the UK, said, well, xenotransplantation's around the corner, but it might be a very long corner. And then Norm Shumway, famous cardiac transplant, who did the first heart transplant in the US, said xenotransplantation is the future of transplant and always will be. I think really a moderate look at that, Sir Roy Kahn was probably right. It's been a long time and much research has been put, but we're really hopefully starting to round the corner. And really, this started with the advent of the technology of large animal cloning and knockouts, being able to manipulate the genome and expression of different genes that are distinct between lower mammals such as pigs and humans. And one of those really is an enzyme that encodes sugars that decorate the cell surface and predispose those organs to early rejection. And so the technology with Dolly the sheep, et cetera, in the late 90s, early 2000s, really set the stage for what we're experiencing today. But those technologies were laborious and really took quite a long time to advance. And it's really in the last few years where we saw the advent of new technologies in genetic engineering, CRISPR-Cas, et cetera, where we can make multiple gene insertions or deletions to make these organs more human-like and more readily accessible to the recipients. And this brought about quite a bit of lay literature. Are genetically modified pigs going to be the solution to the organ shortage problem? My favorite pigs are good for more than just bacon. And really this drove a discussion. So what's different now in the last few years? Are we really finally rounding this corner towards clinical translation? Can pig organs, genetically modified pig organs, be the future of transplantation? This is a nice review by Megan Sykes and David Sachs, really leaders in the field of xenotransplantation over the years, to suggest, in the early 80s and before that, organ survival of pig organs or other non-human species into primates was really measured in the matter of minutes, then to hours, then to weeks. Now, in the late early 2000s, 2000 teens, we're into months and years, and now we're looking at year-long survival in some of these preclinical models that set the stage for the question, are we ready for clinical translation? There's been quite a bit of investment in industry. This is just an example of one of the companies, United Therapeutics, and their conceptual farm for developing, genetically modified pig organs. Another one, eGenesis, with serious amounts of investment going in to move forward to try and address this need. And when we look at the preclinical models, what progress has been made over the last half decade? I'll focus on kidney, but some of the same things could be said in heart. Lung and liver are lagging behind, more immunologic challenging. But if you look at survival times in our standard preclinical model, where we take genetically modified pig organs into a primate, we went from days to weeks to months for quite a series of 20, 30 years. But more recently, again, with some of these genetically engineered pigs that have multiple gene edits, and some of the ideas that we've changed with regards to matching and the immunosuppressant modulation that we're using, we're starting to see advances. And now we have survival of pig kidneys in non-human primates over 4 years, which drives the discussion, is it time to kind of move in to patients? This is coupled with some, again, of the advents in genetic engineering, where this is work from Joe Tector and his group, where we have not just one gene knockout or 2 or 3. When you look at patients on the wait list, each dot here represents a patient on the kidney weight transplant list, and they move from out here where they would be rejected quite quickly down into the lower quadrant in these triple knockout pigs, where the likelihood of antibody-mediated rejection is quite low. Advances from the German group in the non-human primate model for heart transplant. And then, of course, the lay press, as we looked at work that was done at NYU, using now a genetically modified pig kidney into a decedent, recently deceased individual with brain death. And that was recently published in the New England Journal, showing function of that kidney. And of course, the work at Maryland, Dr. Silverman, probably we'll talk about a little bit more, but Dr. Griffith and Dr. Moeden, where they used a pig heart into a living individual who survived for 2 months. So the ideal pig donor, how many genetic edits do we need? Are those really required for success? What are some of the other questions that will involve? Really, when you start to look at survival on dialysis, 2-3 years survival can match about 50%. And so what are we going to offer these patients? I'll quickly just look at patients who have diabetes and on the wait list. They can have survival times that near 50% at 2 or 3 years. And could they benefit from a pig organ? This is nice work in the end here by Jesse Schold, showing a new model to evaluate time to equivalent risk. And just to show you, for an individual that's been on the wait list on dialysis for 2 years and has diabetes, maybe their time to death or removal from the wait list at 16 months is equivalent to what survival benefit their chance of getting a deceased donor transplant. So individuals that really ethically you could justify moving forward with a trial in xenotransplant. So just to end, I hope that we're not on this curvy road where we're just bending one corner yet to round another, but we're really starting to get to the end of the road where we'll move into well thought out, ethically sound clinical trials in patients. And I'll turn the time over to Dr. Silverman.
Thank you. I wasn't sure if my hand was showing everyone, so I'll write in the chat if you don't see it. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I'm ready to go. And so I'll do that. Right, so thank you, Andrew, for laying out the groundwork. And Andrew asked, is it time to move on to patients? Well, the short and long answer is yes and yes. So I'm going to talk about the guidelines for selection of patients in forthcoming xenotransplant clinical trials. And this presentation is based on the forthcoming article that will be published in the Hastings Center report by myself and my colleague, Patrick Odanka. This slide, I have no conflict of interest, and my views represent my own views. I just like to say that the recent transplant that happened at the University of Maryland, our thoughts presented here was informed by the unique issue surrounding the selection of that patient who received the pig heart transplant at the University of Maryland on January 7, 2022. So as laid out by Andrew, the problem is that we have significant challenges with organ transplantation because the need far exceeds the availability of donor organs. As mentioned before, one solution to address this acute shortage is to move forward with xenotransplantation. Now, questions regarding selection criteria include, should we only include patients who do not qualify for advanced heart therapies to advance into clinical trials? Or should we also include patients who have a high likelihood of dying while waiting for an allotransplant? Another question is, do we need to determine a fair allocation process for animal organs? Another question is how to determine acceptable benefit to risk ratio, and hence, do the net risks, are they justified by societal benefits? The next important question is, what is the importance of a psychosocial evaluation, and should we supply additional psychosocial support to prevent inequities? And then lastly, how to ensure an informed and voluntary consent in xenotransplantation. So what are the ethical requirements? To start out, the easy one is that xenotransplantation should be limited to patients with life-threatening diseases who do not qualify for traditional allotransplantation or other advanced heart therapies. And this slide shows the physiologic criteria that render patients ineligible for advanced heart therapies, which includes patients at high immunological risk, complex congenital heart disease, biventricular failure, or structural physiologic contraindication for LVAD implantation. However, should we also include patients for an allotransplant who have a high likelihood of dying while waiting for a transplant? And essentially, after data regarding safety and survival are obtained during the initial stages of xenotransplant clinical trials, there will be a crossover point at which it would be ethical to allow patients to decide whether to receive a xenotransplant or remain on the transplant list. If this is true, will we be confronted with the issue of how to determine a fair allocation of donor animal organs in a society where thousands of people die while waiting for a transplant? And so the question is, do we follow the current allocation system for allotransplant, or will there be enough pig farms so that we don't have to worry about donor animal organs, but then we have to confront the ethics of excessive animal breeding for organs? Benefit risk analysis, for the sake of time. Some people mention, well, the clinical trials will be justified because there's clinical equipoise, but actually, one, clinical equipoise will not exist because there are net risks. Also, clinical equipoise is neither necessary nor sufficient for the ethics of research. And clinical trials should be based on a non-exploitation framework. And as I said before, the net risk will be greater than zero. Is that justified by the societal benefit? And the short answer is yes. An analogy is the practice of allowing consenting adults to participate in high-risk research during public health emergency. The next issue I want to explore is the psychosocial evaluation and additional support. Psychosocial evaluation is considered an essential pre-transplant workup. And it's based on the principle utility. Essentially, we want to give the organs to patients who will have the best outcomes. And it is alleged that a deficient post-transplant compliance is a significant risk factor for graft reaction, and also preoperative noncompliance is an indicator of post-operative noncompliance. However, the patient at the University of Maryland was denied an allo transplant due to poor preoperative compliance. So a fundamental question is, should patients who have been denied a heart allotransplantation due to inadequate psychosocial support and a history of non-compliance be eligible for xenotransplantation clinical trials? The concern is that including those patients would frustrate the ability to fairly evaluate the safety and efficacy of clinical trials, and initial poor results from including these patients could undermine the public confidence in xenotransplantation. However, is it counterintuitive to include patients with a poor psychosocial support and who have been denied allotransplant in xenotransplant trials? The claim is that we should reject the use of psychosocial support parameters that were established for the workup of potential allotransplant patients. The reasons for this is that there is actually a limited evidence base that such criteria indisputably predict post-transplant compliance. There is significant practice variations in the use of such criteria among transplant patients. And more importantly, there are concerns about distributive justice, as the use of psychosocial criteria might disproportionately impact the listing of patients from lower socioeconomic groups, leading to inequities. Essentially, undeserved populations may have a more difficult time demonstrating adequate social support. Also, lower socioeconomic groups might have fewer financial resources to support home-based assistance, and the application of subjective listing criteria might also be shaped by the implicit biases that inherently exist in medicine today. Now, the other thing to consider is that the level of psychosocial support for patients who undergo a xenotransplant will be higher than those receiving allotransplant, for the simple reason that there'll be increased need for monitoring continual follow-up visits. And and also there will be enhanced emotional impact on people of having their lives prolonged with donor animals for a variety of reasons. And the point I want to make is that xenotransplant patients need additional resources, and rather than using psychosocial support criteria to exclude patients from xenotransplant, it would be better to provide them with adequate psychosocial support to better balance utility against that equity and respect for persons. Also, xenotransplant researchers and their institutions have a moral duty grounded in the principle of reciprocity to provide these additional resources. And the last thing is about informed consent challenges to decision-making capacity, which was a great challenge with the patient at the University of Maryland. And I know I'm running out of time, and you all know the challenges with informed consent. And the last two things I want to say is that actually, if one uses a sliding scale determination, which entails that the extent of certainty of decision-making capacity should be dependent on the extent of a patient's decision on his or her welfare. And so in a patient who has no other options, the choice to undergo xenotransplant actually enhances individual welfare, and hence the extent of certainty does not require a high threshold of certainty. And of course, psychiatric evaluation, a consent order, and is there a role for ethics committees? extent of voluntariness. Sure, these are desperate patients, but similar to oncology patients. Another question is there a right to withdraw? And maybe we could discuss that in the Q&A, and informed consent of third parties we could discuss. And hence, let me conclude by saying these ethical issues need further discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Brendan. Dr. Parent?
Thanks, Karen. I'm going to share my screen. And as I bring this up, I'm going to say thank you to Dr. Adams and Dr. Silverman. I believe, Dr. Silverman, I'm sorry that you may have been shortchanged there, because yours is truly the important meat of the ethical considerations. I'm, as the token attorney, I'm tasked with talking about the regulatory issues, but my heart really is in the ethical questions, which ostensibly should drive the regulatory questions. So here are my disclosures. I do a fair bit of work on the ethics of xenotransplant. These are my own views. I'm going to start with a quick note about research involving the newly deceased. I will also ask someone to interrupt me if you can't hear me properly, if there are any problems with my screen. The quick note here is that the vast majority of modern day xenotransplant has taken place in those declared dead by neurologic criteria. This is a potentially valuable research model because it provides a hemodynamically stable human environment, which provides information about how a xenotransplant would function in a living person without having to create harm for non-human living animals, except those used in the experiment as research models, or in living human subjects. So despite the laundry list of rules and regs that I've put on the screen here, this is still a largely unregulated space, and I think it's ripe for regulation to maintain public trust in donation. We have to talk about the OPTN, the Organ Procurement and Transplant Network, which was created by the National Organ Transplant Act in 1984. OPTN is tasked with many things, as you know, one of which is finding donors and potential recipients, but also for certifying transplant programs to make sure that they know what they're doing when performing transplant, and to track those programs to make sure that they're doing what they're supposed to do, that the outcomes are good. Now, there are all kinds of critiques of the OPTN metrics system, but it's very valuable to have someone keeping tabs on transplant programs in this way. And they are also responsible for collecting and tracking data around who donates, who gets a transplant, what happens to those transplants in terms of graft failure or patient death or infection. And all this data is publicly available. Name one other area of medicine that is this closely scrutinized and regulated and held to such high standards. And the answer is there really isn't any other. And I think the implicit reason is we need to be more careful with this area because of the inherently limited resource of human organs. But now, wait a minute. NOTA and OPTN are explicitly only governing human tissue, and that is built into the letter of the law. So if they are only responsible for overseeing the donation and transplant of human tissue, that means that non-human tissue like xenotransplant is currently unregulated by the letter of the law. So who is going to take this on? And I want to put out for consideration whether xenotransplant should be subject to the same regulations if we are saying that maybe in the future this creates a non-limited organ pool. And my answer to the question is yes, absolutely. So just a teaser for later. Quick note about CMS. So transplant is by some metrics the most lucrative medical procedure. And part of the reason for that is payers like CMS, which reimburse for transplant, and CMS is the largest payer for transplant in the United States. But CMS largely follows data from OPTN to determine which programs get what kind of reimbursement. But remember, OPTN currently isn't responsible for xenotransplant, for overseeing xeno. So CMS, in order to cover xenotransplant, is going to need good data from somewhere. to suggest that this is eventually going to be a standard of care that they should pay for because patients are leaving the hospital and reintegrating into society. But in order to get that data, somebody's going to have to foot the bill for more than just one-off xenotransplants, including the expensive long-term immunosuppression. So we have a bit of a catch-22 here, which has to be overcome if xenotransplant is going to hit the limelight. FDA is going to be a critical player, already is. And let's recall that no form of xenotransplant, either the pig heart that took place at UMD or kidneys or any other, are approved by the FDA. So how did the UMD intervention take place? Through an emergency authorization pathway. And this pathway can be pursued when a clinical team is hoping to use an unproven intervention in a patient who has no other viable treatment or curative options, and they're going to die. So those are the requirements. And there's some issues with the approval in this case in terms of, one, safety, right? Let's recall that the xenotransplants have not been approved and the risk-benefit analysis hasn't been fully fleshed out. And it's not just the risks to the individual patient, i.e. this one patient might actually experience more harm than good, but the public health risks of zoonotic viral transfer. And while there has been quite a bit of discussion saying that the risks of zoonoses from xenotransplant under the current model will be quite low, that risk is non-zero. And if it manifests, it could be quite severe. So it's important to keep this in consideration and to question whether the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research was in close enough contact with those who approved the emergency authorization for the original xenotransplant. Second issue, the emergency authorization pathway is a one-off situation, meaning that every time some team wants to do a xenotransplant, they make the appeal and they're not going to be quite required to meet the same sort of rigorous methodological research standards as one would be under a clinical trial situation. So teams aren't necessarily incented to go through the rigmarole of setting up a clinical trial if they can do these emergency authorizations to get their patients who they're fighting for and hopefully want to treat in effective ways, the treatment that they think is good, and also the prestige and limelight of being sort of the first out of the gate with Xeno. Regardless of emergency authorization or clinical trials, FDA is going to be the sheriff for regulatory authority, and they are in the process of helping clinical investigators to understand how to make the best pitch for a clinical trial, including putting out guidance on things like management of zoonotic risk. And they've also decided that pig parts are going to be regulated like drugs, specifically the subset of drugs called biologics because of their chemical intervention in the body. So how are these teams going to get biologics of xenotransplant approved in this regulatory setting? The steps for biologics approval, you have to put forward your preclinical data, in this case, pig parts into baboons. But we all know the limitations of non-human animal models and the translatability to human environments, especially when it comes to immunologic risk and infection risk. So it's possible that the FDA should be paying a little bit more attention to research in the newly deceased, and also eventually computer algorithmic modeling of how pig parts would work in humans. Then you apply for your investigational new drug, which means you need to show the product composition, the preclinical data, and how you would set up your clinical study. And then you have to set up your clinical trial. And as Dr. Silverman relayed, clinical trials are going to be hard to justify in some ways. One, how do we pick the right patients? How do we get an N that is large enough to demonstrate this data will work in human beings? And we're not going to have clinical equipoise. But once we jump through all these tiny little hoops, we'll get a biologics license. Someone will get a biologics license for a xenotransplant. Back to these challenges for a moment. At what point can we say that the public health risk has been significantly and sufficiently mitigated to justify creating this new pool of organs for people? Well, you can't do it until you try it in humans, but you can't try it in humans until you know that it's going to be safe enough. So again, we have another catch-22 here that has to be overcome at some point. And again, getting a big enough N to suggest that this is ready for prime time and also ready for insurance coverage. So quick, who should fill the oversight voids for xenotransplant? Back to the question, should it be subject to the same standards as transplant in terms of licensing, credentialing, monitoring, and public transparency of data? My answer is absolutely it should be. In fact, more medicine should be regulated like transplant. And in this case, it's important to monitor the data, not just for individuals, but also for public health. So who should fill this void? Should it be the OPTN and their subcontractor UNOS, or whoever replaces or could replace UNOS? Or should it be a consortium of organizations more expert in the area of xenotransplant that put forward the recommendations and are responsible for collecting the data? Last thing I'll say, what does scaling xenotransplant look like? What is the ideal future of xenotransplant? And as was already previously mentioned, do we end up all with a pig waiting in the wings for each of us for our organs to fail? And if so, are we just replicating the animal agriculture industry, thereby having a pretty significant impact on the environment that is already difficult to mitigate? Not to mention that pigs are cognitively complex sentient beings with moral standing in their experience. So eventually, the EPA would have to step in and think about how to regulate this if it scales to this size. And it is guaranteed that the meat industry is interested in producing these pigs so that they can capitalize on the system. And back to NOTA, there is no prohibition on the sale of non-human organs as there is with human organs. So might they sell these organs? And if so, try to preserve this as the future model, as opposed to getting where I think we should go, which is getting past the need for living donors and using bioengineered organs. And I'll stop there.
Great presentations, a lot to think about. I've been asked to give a few comments to contextualize some of the ethics issues, and I'll just make a few brief comments because we do have questions, and I would rather open it up to the audience. I do want to say a couple of things, though. There's some through lines that I'm hearing, and of course, people only had 9 minutes, so they couldn't get to everything. But the ethical issue about when to go to do a first-in-human clinical trial is not something that has established criteria. It's going to differ depending on whether it's a drug or a biologic or a device. And the first decision is going to be, if the FDA regulates it, the FDA is going to make that decision, whether that agency thinks it's time to move into the trials. And then, of course, the IRB at the institutions that are hosting the trials have to make that decision. One of the things that I wanted to have everybody think about in terms of this issue about first-in-human that Dr. Adams raised is how do you think about, what do you tell the patient? You know, you're going to be the first one, or you're going to be the first of 10. So we have to think about what is the ethical justification for moving out of animals into humans. And that, of course, is going to have to do with explaining very well to potential participants what the potential risks of harm are and what the potential benefits are. And that's going to raise some interesting issues about how that gets balanced and explained. Dr. Silverman, I saw a point there that kind of comes up in this context about who goes first and how do you get access to a trial in terms of the psychosocial issues. There is the potential, if in the xenotransplant clinical trial context, the psychosocial considerations are not as stringent as they are in the allotransplant context, for purposes of making sure that there aren't disparities in terms of socioeconomic conditions of participants. There's a potential problem, though, that those individuals might think, well, geez, I can't get a human organ because I don't meet those psychosocial standards, but they've been changed in the research context. And does that mean I'm getting a lesser organ and you're giving me access to something that maybe I really don't want, but I can get an organ, and I really want a human one, but I can't get the human one because of the psychosocial issues, but I can get an animal one. And that does raise some concerns about, although the intent might be to increase access to persons with socioeconomic factors, it might actually have a reverse impact, that people think somehow they're getting access to an experiment and to something that nobody knows anything about yet because it's a first in human trial. And then finally, kind of going from those strings about who goes first and how do we make these decisions and what are the criteria, in the context of OPTN and resource allocation, interestingly, human organs are not for sale. They're considered gifts and they're donations. And yet animal organs will actually be commercial products. They will be approved eventually by the FDA and they will cost. And Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, of course, might cover some of that. But it raises some interesting issues in terms of a current allocation system that's based on donation and based on the fact that human body parts cannot be sold. There's no price to them. Nobody's generating revenue from those body parts per se. So that raises some interesting questions about taking a regulatory structure onto a product that's actually considered by the FDA to be a biological product that then is a commercial product. And I think it raises some interesting questions for how do you do that when, as you said, Dr. Parent, we don't do that for any other kinds of biological products or drugs. OPTN and that allocation system is quite unique. So I'll stop there. That's some food for thought. And I will then go to the questions. So we have a question that says, would a patient who receives a xenotransplant later be denied an allotransplant due to medical issues?
Well, let me take that one. That's a very good question. And it has two answers, yes and no. Well, the first answer is no. Well, it depends on why the patient got a xenotransplant. If the person got a xenotransplant because they were not eligible for an allotransplant due to physiologic reasons, then those physiologic reasons will not change after a person has a xenotransplant and now needs an allotransplant. Now, I think that this question also raises the concept of whether xenotransplant will ever be a bridge to allotransplant. And I think the short answer is yes, that it could very well be that when I talked about the crossover point and having patients eligible for a xenotransplant, even though they're on the waiting list for an allotransplant, and all those details obviously need to be worked up. So again, the answer is no for the person who has physiologic contraindications to allotransplant, and the answer could be yes if we start having xenotransplantation as a bridge to allotransplantation.
You're muted, Karen.
Dr. Adams, Dr. Parent, would you like to respond?
No, I'd just add on to Dr. Silverman's comment and Lisa's comment in the question and answer. I mean, she put in parentheses PRA and other issues. So I think those are outstanding questions, meaning we haven't answered them yet with regards to, for example, in kidney transplant, and maybe also, you know, its applicability in heart transplant, is what happens when you get a xenotransplant? Does your level of reactivity towards allotransplant increase? And, you know, there's some, I think, differing data there to suggest that exposure to SLA, or the swine leukocyte antigen, may predispose some individuals, depending on HLA type and the match, to have antibodies that cross-react to either class 1 or class 2. So I think some of that will be, you know, areas for focuses of future research as we go along with this, to make sure that if people you get the opportunity to get a xenotransplant, they're not disadvantaged if their xenotransplant fails for one reason or another, either immunologically or not. And does that disadvantage them in getting an allotransplant? Somebody's on the list. What happens to their waiting time? Do they get prioritized on the allotransplant list? These are all kind of, I think, issues, ethical issues that, and scientific issues that we have to work through.
Dr. Parent? Okay. Next question. For the newly deceased, how long can they remain perfused to test the effectiveness of the xenotransplant? So far, it has been limited to 3 days, but some infections happen later.
That's a critical question, right? Because if we want to gather more information about how this model will function, it has to go on for more than 3 days, right? There are different predictions about how long the neurologically deceased can be maintained in a sort of objective sense, mechanical sense, biological sense. And there are also very important ethical questions. I think the important considerations there are how we get authorization from surviving loved ones. What kind of rights will they have as the experiment is extended? Can they sort of withdraw their loved one decedent after some number of days if they find it too traumatic and decide that they just want to proceed with funeral? If your question is really about sort of the science of it, I think the next step that some teams are hoping to extend to are on the order of weeks, right? There's something intuitively problematic about maybe going straight to months or even years. We have to think about resource allocation and beds and what that might look like. And if anybody's more interested in sort of the ethical framework for that model, I'd be glad to talk more or connect offline.
Great. Dr. Adams or Dr. Silverman?
Well, Brandon mentioned the important ethical issues of a prolonged experiment on a newly deceased patient, and what are the implications for family members. Having said that, I think the other issue is, and I'll leave this to the science community, is such experiments necessary when we're starting to use the pig organs in humans, and what additional information could we gain from extending out the experiment in the newly deceased?
And I'll have a quick response to that, which is if there remain concerns about whether we're ready to move to living human subjects, this is the model to use to get human information without creating those risks, potentially.
I certainly agree with that. That is the question to ask.
Dr. Adams, you want to add anything?
No, I think, both Brendan and Dr. Silverman brought up great points. I do think, there are some limitations with any model that you use, whether it be in the non-human primate, which has been kind of the traditional model for preclinical research before moving into human clinical trials, or in this kind of unique, kind of novel way to test in the recently decedent. And brain death, the physiology, the immunology, isn't necessarily exactly the same as what it is in a living individual. And so, with each model, I think we just have to know the limitations of the model, what we can learn, and take that for the value that it is and put it into our greater knowledge to be able to kind of make the best decision we can to move forward in the context of the drive to help patients that are dying each day on the wait list.
I will just interject something here that you all raised that's interesting. If deceased models provide some information, but not all the kind of information one would need, how many transplants are enough in a living person to know that there's enough information? What's that point at which there's going to be, especially if you're doing transplants in people who are under the criteria that Dr. Silverman raised, that are really, really seriously ill and may not be able to get an allotransplant? How much information is going to be enough? 2 transplants, 3, 4?
I think that's a great question. I think some of the limited guidance that the FDA has given to various groups who are kind of pursuing this is that they're looking for longer term evidence in preclinical models regarding the safety and efficacy and related physiology to genetically modified pig organs, and how you accumulate that data, whether it's in a non-human primate model or a combination of non-human primate and decedent models, depending on are you looking at this as a destination therapy or a bridge therapy? I think will kind of determine what data is needed there. And then their additional guidance has been really a thoughtful and fairly conservative rollout of a clinical trial, given the potential, of the unknowns for the efficacy, but also the broader impact that, the unknown may have on the greater community, i.e. kind of infectious risk, et cetera, that most of us think are minimal, but certainly still to a certain extent unknown until those trials are done. And so I think the rollout of what's been suggested by the FDA has been a fairly conservative approach with very small numbers, staggered in time. And so having a small trial, of 10, 20 patients where you see safety and efficacy before you went to a larger, even phase 2, phase 3 trial of some of these therapies is absolutely going to be necessary. I think before they're going to permit more widespread, I think it's judicious to do that.
We have a regulatory type question. Why are the pig organs biological drugs and not a biological combined product, a drug and device combined product, for example?
That's a great question.
It comes from a JD.
Yeah, a good question, Alta. And frankly, I don't know the answer, and I'm not sure the FDA knows the answer. I think they're just looking at precedent, trying to decide what is this most like. And when we think about, precedent of porcine heart valves, and other sort of biologics, it seems to fit more in that category. And as we know, FDA regulates sort of from the product end as opposed to the process or even the end results. I would be curious, to have a conversation about the potential implications or consequences of regulating it as biologic as opposed to combined or something else.
There's another FDA follow-on. Does the FDA's guidance on xenotransplantation mentioned by Dr. Parent apply to compassionate use cases? If not, why not?
It should technically, right? And that was part of my presentation, is saying it seems as though there might be some disparity between these considerations and what was considered when the emergency authorization was given. But I would be glad to hear, perspective from Dr. Silverman, Dr. Adams.
Dr. Silverman, you want to weigh in?
No, not really, though. I am chomping at the bit to follow up on what Andrew said, and one of the questions about the phase 1 clinical trial with kidneys, but I'll let you exhaust this previous question first.
Okay. Any other comments on the FDA question? Okay. Is the setting of kidney transplantation, please discuss whether the choice of a xenograft recipient should have similar or less risk, death or serious adverse event than being on dialysis?
I can start that discussion out, and maybe it will bring back up Dr. Silverman's points too, with regards to kidney transplant. I think, what we sometimes forget in the prevailing notion, or maybe the lay public, is dialysis, although it's a life-saving therapy, is not an ideal therapy. And many people, die on dialysis. And I think what we didn't really have time to go over, and what I tried to just briefly flash up on the screen for a moment, were some of the recent work by Jesse Schold and others, where we've done this idea of being able to use kidneys that maybe we don't know, there's an unknown as to their survival time, or we know that they last or would survive less time than a standard criteria donor or a living donor, but yet they give benefit to be able to get patients off dialysis. And so when Jesse and his group developed really this innovative approach to looking at time to equivalency. So what's the time and risk of being able to either get, if you're on dialysis, get a deceased donor transplant, or if you become too sick and have to get removed from the wait list, or you die, which most of the time when you get removed from the wait list for being too sick, ultimately that's the outcome. And when you start to parse out different populations of the US from USRDS data, what you determine is there are certain populations, especially those with diabetes, middle to middle age, 50, 60-year-old candidates, depending on race and ethnicity and other things that he could break that down, that your likelihood of dying or getting removed from the wait list is, by 16 to 24 months in some of those population. If you take people that have been on dialysis for less than 2 years and say, at 16 months, you're just as likely to have died or been removed from the wait list as you are to get a kidney transplant. So you start to be able to create populations where, yes, their risk or the potential benefit you could get from a xenotransplant, where we don't know the expected outcome. We have some idea, but we don't know for sure what it's going to provide. But we have a good expectation that it's going to last at least that long, if not longer, and provide benefit and be off of dialysis. And that's just from a mortality consideration, not to mention quality of life of being off dialysis and a lot of the other factors that go into the benefits of transplant. So yeah, Bill's question is spot on. We have to, from an ethical standpoint, I think, have an underpinning and an expectation that patients are going to derive benefit from the therapy. And that justification comes from the data that we already know of outcomes of people that are currently on the wait list or on dialysis right now.
We only have a few minutes left. I'd like to get to the phase 1 question. Dr. Parent, can you answer real quickly? Is there anything unethical or ethical value of keeping someone deceased on more than 72 hours? Could you just answer that real quickly?
Yes, there are ethical questions and concern. Okay. How much longer? What if the body starts going sort of hemodynamically unstable? What kinds of interventions are justifiable to use to keep the body going? What right does the family have to, see the body? What happens if there's another crisis and we need, the ventilator for living, breathing human patients? So there are all kinds of considerations and questions, but they can be managed. And I think there needs to be an oversight entity equivalent to an IRB to think through these things and assemble ad hoc if issues come up. But it can go on for more than 72 hours.
Great, thank you for that. Okay, are the panelists aware of the proposed xenotransplantation phase 1 trial in 20 patients with end-stage kidney disease? I think this is the one, Dr. Silverman, you were ready to answer.
So my answer initially is no, but obviously it is yes now, because I quickly went to the website, and actually I'm not surprised that a phase 1 clinical trial has started for kidney transplantation because dialysis could be considered as rescue therapy, and hence, if I could say, the evidence base doesn't need to be as rigorous as for xenotransplantation involving hearts. However, having said that, it is interesting to think if the LVAD could ever be considered as rescue therapy for people undergoing xenotransplantation. This is also prefaced by the concept that long-term survival with LVAD, the quality of life is considered not as good as with allotransplantation. So it is plausible to think that that the LVAD could be considered as rescue therapy if it's possible to make that switch when someone goes has a heart xenotransplantation. And that's an important question to ask. And the last thing I want to say, because I think our time is almost up, is that the requirement of further preclinical data to start clinical trials with heart xenotransplantation, let me just say it's not that far away. At least this is what my cardiac surgeons colleagues tell me. So we'll see.
I want to say last is that let's not forget all of the other methods to increase the organ supply, get more people registered, improve outcomes with existing organs. And is there anybody, even those who are strong advocates and working in xenotransplant, who wouldn't potentially see the benefit or prefer these other methods with what we know works, if possible, to reduce the organ shortage? while, or at least concomitantly with the development of xenotransplant.
I think we have 1 more minute left, huh?
Well, we are kind of right at 3 o'clock Eastern.
We're right at 3.
And we do have like at least a dozen questions left that I think I can send out to our panelists to answer, and we can give you the answers to those. I'm glad this was a great topic of interest. AST and the Psychosocial and Ethics COP thank our panelists and attendees for today's session. Please remember to complete the evaluation survey. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.